What's up guys, it's Parnellyx. I'm a Challenger Warwick player and did 1000 LP last season, and this is going to be my WARWICK'S items guide and setup guide for season 12 and his 3 main roles, and this includes jungle Warwick, top lane, as well as mid lane Warwick, which is a specialty of mine. WARWICK'S jungle runes are going to be essentially just 2 pages, basically 1 honestly, but it's going to be PTA or lethal tempo. Really depends on what you're looking for. I'm not a fan of lethal tempo. I think it's pretty good if you're going Divine Sunder, because if you go Divine Sunder, you'll have the upfront burst from Divine, and then you'll have the DPS for lethal tempo to make up for it. But for the other builds, I generally prefer to just stick with PTA, because I think the upfront burst is really needed for, giving you kill pressure during ganks. And it allows you to bring targets below half health faster, which gives you your attack speed on your W faster. And I think it's just more reliable. Lethal tempo is great for, early game invades or all-in 1v1s, but I feel like it's just more niche and it feels useless about half the time, so I'm not a fan of it, but I think you can go it. I think it's just a stylistic choice. WARWICK'S first jungle build is going to be the Sunfire build, which is more around scaling. Usually that's not a word that, you attribute to Warwick. A lot of people think that Warwick falls off, but honestly, for a while now, that really hasn't been true, but especially not with this build. This is definitely a scaling build. Warwick's skill is very, very good, almost like a Jax kind of in the jungle with this. The weakness of it is that it's slow and takes a while to feel strong. That's why I don't like running it a ton in high elo, because it takes like 25 minutes before it feels good. But once you get a couple items, especially if you're ahead in snowballing, this item is very, very great into the late game when combined with some of your other legendary items. You become really unkillable, you have tons of AoE damage, and you're just an unstoppable force that can dive in and basically do whatever you want. So yeah, you want to rush into Titanic Hydra and then get your Sunfire. After that, you probably need some more items before you really feel strong, but it is great for snowballing. I'm not suggesting that you just AFK farm with this. It's not like that, but you definitely are going to be kind of weaker early on, but you get really, really strong if you get a lead. And I think it's really easy to use, and you can basically just play however you want and just play like a hyper carry almost as Warwick, which is crazy. The next build is going to be Divine Sunder. There's really 2 iterations of Divine Sunder. First thing you can do is you can go Tiamat into Divine and then build into Titanic Hydra. This is just general, decent across the board. And then you can also go Divine straight up, skipping the Tiamats because Tiamat kind of sucks, and then go into like a Frozen Heart or a Wit's End in order to just have more resist and early fighting power. I'm personally not much of a fan of Divine Sunder. It's pretty good all around, but I don't like it a ton in the jungle, and I'll tell you why. Because Warwick can only really proc Divine with his Q, at least regularly, and Warwick's Q is a 6-second cooldown by default. Of course, this gets reduced by ability haste, but it's really not that... Warwick's not able to apply Divine a ton in team fights, so I just feel like you don't really get much value in the jungle with Divine Sunder. It's more of a laning item for Warwick. So it does give you some decent damage and some decent sustain and tankiness, but I don't think it's Warwick's best option. However, I do want to throw it in here because it is decent. A lot of people do like it, and I think it's also pretty easy to get into, and it's a good starter build for Warwick in the jungle. And also, as mentioned before, I think Lethal Tempo goes great with Divine Sunder because they make up for each other's strengths and weaknesses. Next build is going to be Kraken Slayer. Kraken Slayer is one of the best. It probably is the single overall best build for Warwick, just in general. Most Warwick players in high elo are running this right now because it's just really good. Basically, you can skip Tiamat and rush straight into Kraken Slayer, which is awesome. The Noon Quiver gives you some solid clear speed, not much worse than Tiamat, and the raw AD you get from building into Kraken Slayer is great. It just has such a really good build path. Warwick loves building AD early on, so they actually have some kill pressure and some better clear speed. And once you finish the Kraken Slayer, your DPS is good, your burst is even good because your ultimate, instantly applies the Kraken Slayer, and your damage is fantastic. Now, the one caveat is you are a little bit squishy, which is why you want to build into a Titanic Hydra second so that you have some health to not get one shot. I should also also mention with this build, you're not really playing to dive. You have to kind of adjust your playstyle, at least if you're someone like me who likes to dive in deep into the fights. You're not as much of a, someone who dives the backline, kills the carries, and plays like an assassin. You are more of a front to back, tank shredder or like bruiser shredder or whatever. You just kind of play more front to back and just deal a lot of DPS to the front line and kind of play more scrappy and based around skirmishing. That is what this build's about, and it's really good at it because it's good the entire game. Feels good from the beginning to the end. Never gets like absolutely amazing, but it does feel just really, really solid across the board. And then after you build your Titanic, you're usually going to want to just default to a Sterix Gauge because it just, again, gives you some more damage, but it also gives you that burst protection so that if anyone dives you while you're hitting the front line, you're going to be like really, really hard to burst, especially when combined with your E. The last build is a special build of mine that I'm excited to talk about. It's something I came up with recently that really fits my playstyle, but I do feel like it's actually really good, especially in higher elo. I probably wouldn't recommend you building this in like your gold ranked games, although if it fits your playstyle, it fits your playstyle. But it is a more of a faster paced build that's not as much about scaling, and it's more around making picks and having an impact in the jungle in the early mid game. And this is my assassin build. It is Gale Force into Guardian Angel. Now the Gale Force has similar strengths to Kraken Slayer for obvious reasons, but the active that it provides you gives you so much versatility. You have, some execution damage, which is fantastic for finishing off opponents. Great in the mid game. Gives you some mobility so that you can use to escape, or you can use the gap close and just you can like Gale Force into Q onto someone. It's just very versatile in how you can use it. And when you go into Guardian Angel next, you'll have such an OP tool for survivability. GA is great if you're building like really, really squishy and you're playing more for burst, because you can go in, get a kill, burst someone down, and then when the rest of the team uses a bunch of spells on you, you're still going to revive after a few seconds, and you can easily win the fight off of that. The key to this build, however, is the rune setup. The rune setup is very crucial. It's all about going Ingenious Hunter. This build crazily abuses Ingenious Hunter, and is very specific to this build because with Ingenious Hunter, you get a 60-second cooldown on your Gale Force, and you get roughly a 3-minute cooldown on your Guardian Angel, which is so insane. You get like almost 2 minutes taken off of your GA, and you're able to just use your GA like almost like every 2 fights. And when you have your GA up, you're probably going to win the fight, which is crazy. Now, the playstyle of this build that I normally how this build goes is once I have my Gale Force, I am going to be playing more aggro in the early mid game, especially considering you're getting some good AD when building into Gale Force. But once you have your Gale Force, you are looking to play around your Gale Force and your ultimate cooldowns. If they're both on cooldown, then generally speaking, you want to just farm and wait for them to come back up. And when they are both up, you basically have a free kill. And guess what? Gale Force a minute cooldown, your ultimate's almost a minute cooldown. You get a free kill almost every minute. So that's the thing that I really love about this build, is it's the most interactive in the early mid game and allows you, it's just the most fast-paced build for Warwick at the moment. And I think it's just really, really fun. It is a build that I strictly would use against squishier team comps though. It's not going to be good against tanks or bruisers for obvious reasons, but in solo queue, you'll often play against like 4 squishies or something. So this build can be great at dealing with those type of comps. For top lane and in the mid lane, your runes are going to be between 2 different rune pages. The first is going to be Grass of the Undying. This is a underrated rune page, I feel, for just lane Warwick. People don't run it as much as they should because it's really good for playing around your Q poke when playing against champions that are ranged or champions that are taking short trades and are looking to in and out fights. So playing against, for example, mages and ADCs, as well as short range fighters like Riven or Fiora or Camille. It is just really good for just playing a lane bully and being able to properly trade with these champions when they go for trades. Your next bet is going to be Lethal Tempo, which is just going to be good against champions that you can just straight up all in 100-0. So melee champions like Wukong, Mordekaiser, or Irelia, for example, are just some champions that you're able to just scrap to death. Champions like Darius as well, and will just allow you to just completely bully them and just win every all in and prevent them from doing what they want to do. Now I will you know, say for mid lane Warwick, you're generally going to not want to go lethal tempo. You're going to rather go PTA in some of these matchups, but in the mid lane, like 95% of the time, you're going to be going grasp anyways. Top lane, it's a little bit more 50-50 between grasp and lethal tempo. The builds for top lane Warwick, I've been running like 2 main builds, although there's going to be 2 like secondary builds that I'll cover that are optional. But in order to get Challenger 1000 LP last season, these are what I ran. So the first one is going to be Divine Thunder Rush into Titanic Hydra. This build is just about lane bullying your opponents. Divine Thunder is insane for lane and allows you to just, you know, snowball really hard and just be a really crazy lane bully. Gives you really good sustain, good damage, and it scales decent across the board. Now against matchups that I can't really snowball against, or maybe I can snowball so hard against them regardless that I don't need Divine Thunder and it can afford to build more for scaling, I would go something like, well, I'd go with my Sunfire build. Go Titanic Hydra into Sunfire Aegis, and you'll just have really good late game. You're not going to be as strong in the laning phase, but you will have better scaling. And if you value that, then it is important to go. And I do go at like half the time in the top lane. The other top lane builds are going to be Divine Sunder into Frozen Heart or Wit's End. This is one that I'm not as much of a fan of. I've tried it myself a few times. I think it's felt good sometimes, but I prefer Titanic Hydra just because I think the wave clear is very important in the top lane for helping you know, push out the lane, get the turrets, and, you know, maybe counter jungle and then finally rotate to fights. I think it's just good for getting you ahead. But I feel like if you're really behind or you're going for more of like a cheaper power spike, or the enemy team just has a lot of armor, then you might just want to just go for a Frozen Heart. And, you know, optionally, you can also go for a Wit's End instead, or even after the Frozen Heart, so you have a lot of resist. This just makes you very, very beefy and gives you just some decent damage. You're playing around your Q cooldown with this. A lot of Warwick players do like this, but I'm not as much of a fan, so I generally stay away from it, but I would recommend checking it out for yourself. And then the last build is a situational niche build that can be very, very good. It is the snowballiest top lane build, but it's only in certain situations, and that is Kraken Slayer. It's just the Kraken Slayer build. As mentioned in the jungle build, you're rushing into Kraken Slayer, but in the top lane, it's more niche because if you fall behind with this, it feels really bad. You're going to be too squishy, you're going to get bullied really hard, and you won't be able to actually apply DPS that the Kraken Slayer provides you if you're behind. The benefits of this build is a better build path. You can build raw AD to bully your opponent early on, so it's great if you get ahead, and the Kraken Slayer just gives you just so much snowball potential essentially. But I wouldn't go it unless you're already snowballing, and I also wouldn't go it in a lot of different matchups. So I'd only go it if in like matchups where you can actually reliably stick on your opponent and get a lot of value at the Kraken Slayer. So if you're playing against like a Wukong, maybe something like that, or a Mordekaiser, champions where, you know, maybe you'd want to go like lethal tempo or PTA against, is probably when Kraken Slayer is going to be the best most of the time. But again, it is a very risky build, so I only go it pretty rarely. And lastly, the mid lane Warwick build that I run basically every game is going to be just simply the Sunfire build. But I wanted to explain it in more context as to why this is the only build I run in the mid lane. And the reason is simply because Titanic Hydra is too good to pass up on in the mid lane. The wave clear is very, very crucial for getting mid lane prio, allows you to shove out, and then you can, you know, look to rotate with your team. It also gives you range poke with the splash damage. When you hit minions and like the enemy mage, say, you know, goes up to harass you, and you hit them a couple times with the splash damage when you're farming minions and pushing out the wave, you're going to be able to chunk them down and potentially set up a kill. You know, if that mage gets down to like 60% health, suddenly you actually have kill pressure on them when your ultimate is up. On top of that, the damage it provides is good DPS, decent burst, gives you just a little bit of everything. And the health is also very important in regards to surviving the laning phase, as you're going to be able to, you know, you're going to be less vulnerable to gank. So if you have a lot of health, then when the jungler comes to gank you, it's going to be much harder to just, you know, one-shot you and kill you. So you become more, you know, less gank prone, and you're able to have more agency in the mid lane. And that really is the main reason as to why you go this build, because you really want to go Titanic. It's good in majority of situations in the mid lane, so you normally want to just rush into it. And then you might be thinking, well, you can't just go like Divine Center afterwards. But the thing is, afterwards, laning phase is going to start to dissolve, and going like a Divine isn't as good because of the fact that Divine is more of a laning rune, and if the laning phase is ending, it's not going to be as effective. You'd rather go more for scaling and team fighting, which is why I like to go Sunfire Aegis. Another note I want to just mention, if you are behind in the matchup in the mid lane, right now I'm preferring just going into the health portion of the Titanic first before the Tiamat. If you get ahead, you can go Tiamat if you want the shove, but don't feel bad if you're just building a bunch of raw health from building the Giant Spell and the Ruby Crystal early on. I think it's a safe option, especially if you are behind early on. But once you get that Titanic Hydra, that is the spike you're looking for. And now we can just briefly talk about the filler items that just kind of fit into every build because they're all just good for Warwick and work in every situation depending, regardless of your play style. So there's going to be actually like 2 tiers here. There's tier 1, which are the primary items that you're going to be building nearly every game because they're just the most efficient items for Warwick in general. And then the tier 2 items are going to be more niche and situational. So the tier 1 items are going to be Death's Dance and GA for your armor options, Force of Nature and Wit's End for your MR options, and Sterix is just like an all-arounder in general item. So yeah, GA is great if you are like unkillable or you're really behind. Death's Dance is kind of good in between, just has really good synergy with Warwick. Force of Nature, it just makes you the tankiest of the MR items, and Wit's End gives you some damage as well, so it depends on what you prefer there. And like I said, just Sterix is just good in general. If you don't know what to build Sterix. It's always a great item. For your tier 2 items, you're going to have Serpents for anti-shield. You need to make sure that you have Titanic Hydra to get much value out of Serpents, as well as Chainsword as well. But both these items are great with work because you are able to apply in an AoE cone off the splash damage of Titanic and get good value, plus the AD they grant is nice. So these are both pretty good options. Warwick might not be the best users of the items, but he's pretty good. Hullbreaker is situational in the top lane and the mid lane. I don't really build it much because Sterix is so good, but I still think it's pretty decent. The only issue is I feel like Warwick's not like a primary split pusher. He generally prefers to group at some point. So it really just kind of depends on if you want to stay in the side lane more and play for yourself. Maw, I only listed Maw here, not because I ever really buy it, but because it's getting buffed. So just kind of small disclaimer, I'm pretty sure it's getting buffed to not be useless. So things might change. This might even be a tier 1 item eventually, but we'll see. Thornmail is obviously great as far as, grievous wounds and defensive power with the armor. Although I will mention I generally prefer Chainsword. I feel like it's more reliable. So unless the enemy team, has a lot of like AD, in which case you would prefer the Thornmail. But if they're not AD heavy, Chainsword is going to give you more reliable anti-heal application, and the damage and CDR and health that grants is just nice in general. Randuin's is great if they have a lot of crits. Gargoyle Stoneplate is great just as like a super tank item late game. I don't really build it much, but I'm trying to build it more. So I've been trying the combination of Hullbreaker plus Gargoyle Stoneplate because the resist just kind of ramps up and it's pretty nice. But I just want to throw this in there as an option. I'm still experimenting with it. It just usually just feels like I'd rather go Sterix, or something like that. And then Abyssal Mask is very niche. This item is like, it's good, but the thing is you need to have a lot of magic damage in your team, and the enemy team also has to have a lot of magic damage. Then it's really good, but that's a pretty niche situation, so yeah.